Here, have a seat. I'm sitting. Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. My name is Teresa Cardinal-Brown. I am the Director of Immigration Cross-Border Policy here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are happy to have you here for this event where we are discussing merit-based immigration, in particularly looking at the systems of Australia and Canada and what that might mean if we would try to do something in the United States. A little bit of background on the Bipartisan Policy Center, if you're new to us. We were founded about 10 years ago by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Tom Daschle, Howard Baker, George Mitchell, and Bob Dole. And our mission is to try to create what we believe are pragmatic and politically possible solutions to some of the biggest challenges we have in this country, and I think immigration qualifies in that ranking. We decided to do this program in part because many of you have heard this term, merit-based immigration, used in the press a lot. Our president has called for a merit-based immigration system and has seemed to refer to the Canadian and Australian systems as models for what we might try to do. But the term merit-based doesn't really have any definition. It's unclear what that means. So we're going to dive down into this a little bit. So with me, I want to introduce our guests. To my immediate left is Michael Willard. Michael is Assistant Secretary of the Economic Policy Branch, Immigration and Citizenship Policy Division, Department of Home Affairs, Embassy of Australia. No, not Embassy, Government of Australia. He wins for coming the farthest because he's all the way from Canberra. So thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. Next to him is André Valotaire. André is Minister Counselor for Immigration at the Embassy of Canada. He is responsible for the migration portfolio as well as overseeing the actual immigration operations at Canada's consulates in Los Angeles and New York. And at the far end, who will be giving the U.S. perspective, is Dan Griswold. Dan is Senior Research Fellow and Co-Director of the Program on the American Economy and Globalization at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He has written a lot on immigration and trade policy for a long time and has been in this area for a while and has recently written about what a merit-based system might look like in the United States. So thank you very much to our guests. And we'll get started with some basic questions because I'm imagining that a lot of people really don't know much about the Canadian and Australian system. If they know anything, they probably say, oh, it's points-based or it's merit-based, and what does that mean? So Michael, let me start with Australia. We're going to go in order, alphabetical order of our Commonwealth friends here. Tell us a little bit about the Australian system. Would you describe it as merit-based? And how do you go about selecting immigrants? Is it just points? Are there other criteria? In 3 to 5 minutes, condense it in.
Will do. Thanks, Teresa, and thanks for the invitation to be here. And I should point out I don't come with a migration prescription from down under for the US. I'm just here to talk about our government system, which of course is designed for Australia. And hopefully can inform you a little bit more about our system. We are, and that's partly because that's a diplomatic thing to do, but it's also because we are very different countries, even though I think you could say we're 3 of the major modern immigration countries. We do have very different systems. A couple of things that strike me that are very different between our countries are the proportion of overseas born within our populations. So in Australia, that figure is over 28% of our population is overseas born. From OECD data, I understand the figure in the US is more like around 13%. And I understand Canada is somewhere in between those two, around 20%. So that's one difference, and of course there's many others, not least the way in which immigration rules come about in our respective countries. And we operate under a Migration Act of our Parliament, which allows our minister to make regulations that set the rules for how visas work. And again, different system in each country. But in terms of our immigration program, there's essentially 2 large components. One is our migration program, which is currently set at a ceiling of 190,000 places for this year. We also have a humanitarian program, which is set around 18,000 places. I'll focus on our migration program and the different components there, because as we work towards this idea of merit-based immigration, I think what we're talking about is probably the skilled migration component of that program, And our skilled migration program is 128,000 places of that 190,000. The remainder go to family migrants, which are mostly partners, but also parents and other family migrants. Now, our program is described as a hybrid program, our skilled migration program. We have points-tested components. That is individuals without a specific sponsor who are entering on the basis of their skills and attributes, to which we have allocated points, and essentially the highest scoring people are those who are the first ones invited to apply for a visa under that program. But we also have a very large employer-sponsored cohort within those 128,000 places. And we also have regional cohorts. Now, in Australia, migration is the responsibility of our Commonwealth, of the federal government. So there is no constitutional right for our states to manage any component of migration. But our system is set up in such a way that the states each have capacity to nominate migrants to come to their own states. And that's the Commonwealth has used its powers to set up the system to allow states to do that. So there's also a component there for states, and there's also an element that tries to encourage regional migration. So provides concessional entry for people going to particular parts of Australia. Those of you familiar with Australia will know we have a very large percentage of our population is urban and a large percentage is on the eastern seaboard. So people willing to migrate to other areas who are in need can migrate under concessional basis. Within that skilled component, so we have that points-tested category, we have the employer-sponsored category, and we have the state or regional sponsored categories. We also have a business innovation investment program. That's about 7,000 places out of those 128,000 places. And that's really an element that a lot of governments around the world are trying to grapple with, is to how do you attract entrepreneurial talent. And many countries have programs. Most of them are fairly new. I think it's very hard to tell how many of those programs are going at this stage. And finally, we have a very small component, 200 places, for distinguished talent within our program, which is your Nobel Prize winners or perhaps Olympic athletes, particularly in Australia's case. So that's the basis for our program. I thought I'd just very quickly point out a couple of trends in our program that have occurred over the past couple of decades, and then perhaps leave it to everyone for conversation. And those trends are we've moved from a program that was dominated by family reunion to a program that's now dominated by skilled migration. So that the breakdown is roughly 2/3 skilled migration, 1/3 family reunion. Now, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the breakdown was very heavily weighted towards family reunion. So that's been a shift over time within the Australian program. Another element that's worth pointing out here is that we're talking about permanent migration programs, but of course, with the advent of globalisation, what I think every country is seeing is the number of temporary migrants is increasing much more quickly than the number of permanent migrants. So the question of how you manage temporary migrants and how you manage their transition onto a permanent visa or not, as the case may be, is a very much a topical question for Australia. If you look at the rate of growth of our temporary cohort, and we're talking temporary workers, students, work and holiday makers, that's growing far faster than our permanent cohort. Many have aspirations to move on to a permanent visa. How do you accommodate that, and how do you control that? Is another key question for us. Within our skilled cohort, we used to have a large proportion of points-tested migrants. We now have a growing proportion of employer-sponsored migrants. So we went from predominantly a human capital skilled program to a program that's now balanced between human capital and demand-driven migration. So there's some of the key trends. I'd point out that our system is designed to respond to economic need. So there are a number of levers built into it that will adjust automatically in line with what our labour markets are telling us. We also tend to make changes to the system fairly regularly. So it's always a work in progress because we're trying to align it with what we think Australia needs. So I might stop there as a brief introduction, but welcome discussion later in the day.
Thank you very much. Andre, so around here, people talk about the Australian and Canadian systems like they're interchangeable, but clearly there are differences. Michael pointed out a couple of them, but talk to us a little bit now about the Canadian system and how you balance the skilled migration, family-based, humanitarian, and your system.
Merci beaucoup, et merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. And I promise I'll do the rest of the presentation in English, but I wanted to point out one of the fundamental specificity of our country. It's a bilingual, and very much our immigrations also, and every aspect of life takes this into account. And I guess I won't have to remind you because you'll hear it from the accent, right? So one of the important distinctions with Australia is that right from our constitution, this is a shared responsibility between provinces and territories and the federal government. So the management of immigration in Canada is very much a partnership with the province and territories. And it involves also a lot of local and regional actors. And that has been a key success, I think, for our program, is that it's very much built on partnership. Also, as part of that responsibility for the province and territories, because Quebec is a French majority, then it had obtained, through a special accord, special powers under immigration. So they select their own economic migrants, and also they're responsible for the integration to make sure they can integrate to that distinctive society. Our program also, our immigration program, is very much a manage and balance program. And it has been since its inception. So balance because it's not just merit-based, which we refer to as economic migration, but also give a lot of importance to family reunification and to humanitarian program. So the humanitarian will include, people we give protection as per international obligation and refugees that are resettled. So the merit-based or the economic migration is only about 58 to 60% of our program. The rest is divided between family reunification at about 27%. It changed from year to year, but that's about the numbers. And mostly focusing on the nuclear families, so children, dependent children, spouses, and some number of parents and grandparents. And the third component, the humanitarian aspect, is 15%. And it's been fairly steady over the years as well. As Michael had said, we have about 20% of our population that is foreign-born, and that's growing. And that changed also because this, and they've been settling quite well. It's been a success in our immigration, and 88% of them become citizens at the earliest possible time. And our goal is to make them full citizens as quickly as possible. Another aspect that is important for our overall immigration program is the integration. So we want to make sure that people integrate, and the federal government is spending over $1 billion per year in settlement program, which is then supplemented at the provincial territorial level, and as in the US, with interaction by civil society and other stakeholders. Also, the annual targets, that's how we call it, we go and present them in Parliament every year. So it has to be approved by Parliament. And this year they will be at 310,000. And out of those, 177,000 plus will be economic migrants. In the economic migrants, a little bit like Australia, we don't have only a point-based system. So we have various streams under the economic migrants. One of them is provincial nominees, and it's basically the provinces nominates people who they want to come to their jurisdiction. And that's recognizing that they're the best place to know what is the needs they have regionally and locally. So that allows for that movement that is specific to the needs of one area of Canada. They nominate. We still do the admissibility, so ensuring that they can enter Canada and they don't pose a threat. So that's, again, the partnership is present there. We have also a little component of entrepreneurs, but that's very small. And the rest is federal economic program. So there's a federal skilled worker, federal skilled trade, and then Canada Experience Class, which is to recognize people who have worked in Canada. And that goes through a point system. The point system gives points, as in Australia, towards human capital, but also range employment. And it's quite balanced. It's a hybrid. We went from years to years changing, between the two. We started with purely arranged employment, then switched to human capital, and now it's an hybrid. And we monitor constantly the outcome of immigrants and adjust the system as we go. And what was found is that while arranged employment has the best outcome in the short term, over the long term, human capital is better to move the economy towards growth and innovation. I think I will stop for now and then welcome the question after that.
Don't worry, I'm taking copious notes. There'll be lots of questions. So Dan, I think many of our audience who are familiar with the American system already have noticed some differences and similarities, but why don't you talk a little bit about what your research has shown and sort of how we differ from those, and what would be some of the challenges if we were to do this?
Yes, and thanks for the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me here and these distinguished guests. That was a great Super Bowl ad for Australia tourism.
That's right. That was good. How many
maybe
saw that?
Maybe want to book my ticket there. Maybe even emigrate there. I don't know.
I have to admit, I groaned initially thinking they were remaking Crocodile Dundee, but it turned out okay.
That's great. Well, I've come to lavish mostly praise. I think the comparison between the United States and the Australian and Canadian systems is welcome. Maybe not for the reasons that some of the people trying to compare them intend. I'm going to talk mostly about the positive elements of their systems that I think we can learn from, and maybe do a little bit of nitpicking on what we may not want to follow as fully. The theme seems to be more rather than less. More employment, skills-based immigration. Both countries, their overall immigrant pool is about 60% employment-based. Ours is 14%. We're overwhelmingly family-based. They were kind enough to let me put up some charts here. This really tells a story. I think to talk about immigration, you really have to look at it as a rate. Both these wonderful countries have populations that are about a tenth of ours, if not less. So when they let in 300,000 immigrants, it's going to have a disproportional impact on that country as opposed to ours, a country of 325 million. And what you get from this chart is it isn't that they are more stingy than we are in allowing family-based migration. They're actually about the same on a percentage. It's just that they are overwhelmingly more open to employment-based migration. If you look at the chart, family-based immigration, that's the second, the bottom bar is humanitarian refugees. The middle bar is family-based migration as a share of the overall population. In both the United States and Canada, it's about 2 family-based immigrants per year per 1,000 population. In Australia, it's 2.5, so fairly similar. The huge difference is in how much more open they are as a share of their population to employment-based immigration. Of course, we're mostly talking skills-based, college-educated, skills-based immigration. in Canada, and these figures are 2013 to 2015 based on the OECD. They were the latest numbers I had. This is straight from my study for Mercatus in October. In Canada, it's 4.5 employment-based migrants per year per thousand population. In Australia, it's 5.5. In the United States, it's 0.5, half. So 9 times as many employment-based migrants to Canada as a share of their population, 11 times in Australia. Canada's even upping that now. You heard their annual targets. They'll soon be 1%, or the overall migration numbers, they're more than twice as open to immigration as a share of their population. When Canada follows through on increasing their annual targets, that's going to get them up to about 1% of their population per year in immigration coming in. That's almost 3 times what it is in the United States. If we had the same proportional immigration allowances as these 2 countries do, we'd be letting in, instead of 1.1 million green cards a year, we'd be awarding 2 to 3 million per year. And it's sustained over time. This isn't some new turnaround. You heard them both refer to the foreign-born population as a share of the overall population. They were exactly right. In the US, it's about 13.5. Canada, it's 20. Australia, it's 28. But this just shows you the trend over time. That has been a fact going back for almost 3 decades, and the trend in all 3 countries is up. But we're not getting any closer to them. They're more. If we're an immigrant country, they're an immigrant country times 2. The composition of the immigrants with Canada, it's pretty remarkably similar. Are the top 4 source countries for permanent immigration. 3 of the countries are similar for the U.S. and Canada. It's the Philippines, China, and India. We happen to have Mexico for obvious reasons. There it's Pakistan. Thank you. Australia is a little different, China and India, but also for historical ties, Great Britain and New Zealand. And I'll just end with this observation, then I'll get into my nitpicking. I think by any measure, these are 2 successful, pluralistic, democratic countries with thriving open market economies. And those higher levels of immigration don't seem to have caused them any problems that should make us hesitate to increase our overall immigration. I'll just close on a couple of nitpicky things on the point system. Well, first off, in this country, I think when they talk merit-based immigration, it's a bit of a code word for reducing overall immigration numbers. If you look at the merit-based point system in the RAISE Act, for example, it's very restrictive, more restrictive than these other 2 countries that they're holed up as an example. There are some problems that I've read about with a strict merit-based system. One is screening. Immigrants have an incentive to maybe exaggerate their language or education skills. It's required governments to do some third-party checking. If you rely on employers have the greatest incentive you can think of to make sure somebody's got the right credentials because they're hiring that person. There can tend to be something of a mismatch between the skill sets of the immigrants coming in and what industry needs. And in both countries, you've tended, at least in the past, to have a little bit of a higher, say, unemployment rate among skilled workers than in this country, because when they come in, they pretty much by definition have a job. The numbers can be a bit mismatched. You can have an oversupply at times and undersupply in others. You're hearing that in both those countries, they're moving more towards, I think they both use the term hybrid system. That would be fine, but I'll just end on a kind of a philosophical note. I tend to have a preference philosophically, but I think based on experience that a more bottom-up system relying on the market signals of hundreds of thousands of employers and what kind of workers they need tends to give better results in terms of matching immigrants with the opportunities here than a kind of top-down government-managed system where people in government with good motives but not always with enough information are trying to decide what kind of immigrants we need. So I know both the United States and the European Union tend to have more of a demand-driven, employer-driven system. So I would just say let's fully embrace our friends in Canada and Australia in the example they set in terms of the numbers and tilting more towards more employment-based, not cutting seriously family. But I'd be hesitant to embrace a merit-based system. I think a employer-driven demand-side system is better. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. All right, so lots of food for thought. I'm going to ask some follow-up questions. So one of the questions I have for you, both Michael and Andrea, is, again, in this conversation of merit-based, as I mentioned at the beginning, merit-based doesn't have a defined definition in immigration law in our systems. And I think you both mentioned that your skills selection process, it's not just about the individual skills, but there's also a component of what your country needs, right? So there is that sort of, looking at the economy. So how do you define skills? Is it just, you have to have a graduate degree or PhD or education level, but what if you're like a highly skilled technician, or you're just in an occupation that's heavily in demand that may not require a lot of education or work skills? Michael, do you want to talk how you balance those needs?
So our Bureau of Statistics does a lot of work on labour market statistics, and as part of that work they do a job of classifying every occupation in Australia. I think there's 1,200 or so occupations that are classified. That includes a broad indication of what educational qualifications would be required to undertake that job. And our migration is focused on the skills end, so there are 5 classifications. And ours takes people down to what we call skill level 3, which is really you might say 2 years of post-higher education training. This could include a trades field, and it could include most professional jobs. On top of that, we have our equivalent of Department of Labour, I guess, who look at do a lot of modelling and look at what is the long-term need in terms of these occupations. So that sits on the points tested side. We also have the employer-sponsored side, which is more filling short-term needs in the economy. And that's really driven by employers, I think, as Dan talked about.
That can be at any skill level, that employer-driven?
It's still only skilled migration. We've got some programs at the unskilled level, but very small programs, and with a lot of controls around them.
And do those require a labour market test? The employer has to first test to try to see if they can find Australians, or is it sort of a given that certain occupations are going to be in short supply? Yeah,
the labour market testing process is actually currently being expanded. It used to be just at the trades level. It's now being expanded to professional levels as well. It's focused on the temporary side of migration, so temporary employer-sponsored migration is where the labour market test occurs.
Okay, but on permanent migration, not necessarily.
There's a range of requirements. There's not so much a labour market test, but there are requirements that go to salary level, and the government's very keen to see a situation where migrants aren't displacing Australians. Migrants are complementing Australians in the workplace.
Right. Andre, in the Canadian system, how do you regulate between sort of, as you said, the human capital and what Canada's economy is demanding?
Yeah, similarly to Australia, then we have a lot of studies that are looking at what are the longer term needs of the economy, and that more in the highly skilled, or the skilled occupation. I shouldn't say highly skilled. We go into the management, and it's National Occupation Guide for us, but the professional level, the management level, and then the skilled trade to be able to meet those demands. And that's, people have to be in those occupations to enter the point system, if you want to say. But the provinces and territories, through their nomination, can also, and they do their own research, and they can also nominate people at lower skill level, if that's what their regional needs are. And for example, in Manitoba at one point, they needed people to work in their meat packing industries. So they used a nomination. And that's the flexibility in the system to allow that, while the federal level programs are looking at the longer term needs. And there is always the possibility for the employers in either system, either in the provincial nominee system or in the point system, to make an offer of employment. And that will give more points to, and then ensure the people can go through the system. So that's how we manage it, the balance between the two.
So Dan, I was just going to turn to you. Like I hear this, and it seems they both talk about managed systems.
Yeah.
A lot of governmental actors here, a lot of statisticians and labor markets, and a lot of sort of the government figuring out what's needed, provincial or federal. Our system is very different. It's pretty much congressionally mandated at the legislative level. The numbers are set in statute. We haven't changed them in 30-odd years.
Yes.
How would we manage this?
And so much has changed in those 30 years. Yes. Well, first off, I want to pick up on the Canadian provincial system, because there have been proposals in Congress to have some state-based visas here in the United States, which I think is a very intriguing idea and would allow the states that see their need to respond to that. But yes, our Bureau of Labor Statistics also goes through an exercise where on a periodic basis, every year or two, they'll try to project 10 years out the growth in particular job categories. And I'll just say the record's mixed on that. It's just, again, I don't question anybody's motives. I just question the ability of governments to anticipate the needs. There are whole job categories that we couldn't even think of 25 years ago, and others that were prominent 25 years ago that have completely disappeared. And so I really think we are better off relying on private industry. I have to say, we do have a kind of hybrid system here in the United States, in that if you look at the H-1B visas as a kind of probation for transitioning to green cards, there, of course, we have generally a requirement that you have a bachelor's degree. And I was glad to hear Andre say there, especially through the provincial system, there is an opening for lower skilled workers, because, and I like what Michael said too about immigrants complementing Americans. We tend to have a demand for immigrants on the high end because there just aren't enough Americans with PhDs in the STEM subjects to feed industry. But we also have a demand on the lower end, where the number of Americans who've traditionally filled these low-skilled jobs continues to shrink because we're getting better educated. And a merit-based system might overlook that entirely. And of course, that's what drives illegal immigration. We don't have sufficient legal channels for people to come in at the lower end. So you put all that together, and I think we can pick and choose the better parts of their system, including their overall openness to more immigrants, but not adopt wholesale the merit-based system for all the reasons I mentioned.
So I'll go back to our foreign friends. So in terms of measuring the success of your migration programs, you know, we tend to look at a lot of public pollings. You both mentioned that you look at sort of the success of the immigrants themselves and integration, whether or not they become citizens of your country, those kind of things. But how do your governments respectively measure whether or not they think their program is successful, and how does that play out?
So there's a couple of indicators in Australia. We run what we call a continuous survey of Australia's migrants, which looks at, this is purely labour market focused. It's about economic migrants or economic impact of migrants, and it looks at their circumstances in the labour market over 6 months after their arrival, and then 18 months after their arrival. And that's published on our website, and there's a lot of interesting information there about the different streams that we have. There's also this is a non-government entity, but a well-established survey conducted by the Scanlon Foundation in Australia that looks at attitudes towards immigration. I guess tracks how the Australian public feels about immigration over time, and that's been running for over 10 years now. It's an annual survey, which is another good piece of information. The government also, similar to the Canadian model, every year has to bring the migration program forward to Parliament, usually in our budget process. And as we do that, there's a period of consultation that involves public consultation around attitudes towards the program and what the composition should be and what the numbers should be.
Andre, how does Canada evaluate?
Yeah. It's very similar. We use different sources, but they're very similar. So yeah, every time we bring the admission plans to Parliament, then we'll have a broad consultation first with the province and territories, but then with all the relevant stakeholders through Canada to gather what they think should be the needs. That would be employers. They will look also with the civil society. They will look at the municipalities. They look at the education stakeholder, because as you grow your population and you get more immigrants, you have to ensure that there's room in the school, and it's all organized that way. So there's a lot of polling in that goes directly in those consultations before we bring a plan to Parliament. And last year was the first time that we didn't go only with an annual plan. We went with the 3-year plan. And that's recognizing as well to give more flexibility to all the actors in society to plan ahead. So not just year to year, but know that in 2 years' time, there'll be that many immigrants in 3 years' time. So there's that process. We have also an annual survey that takes that is done by the government every year and polls the opinion of Canada. It's at least once a year. It's often done on a more frequent basis if we feel that there is a need, that there may be something happening that we need to get the pulse of Canadians. And in the latest one that we have done, everybody, a large majority was supportive of higher level of immigration and in the 3 streams. So we looked at the 3 streams: humanitarian, family, economics. There was broad support. And then we have the measuring of outcomes of immigrants, and that's done through a linkage between the immigrant data with the tax data, and it measures the income of immigrants after a year, after 2 years, after, and even the second generation afterwards. And to measure what has been the success, it can drill down by age, nationality, education, categories, and it allows us to know if we need to adjust the system. And that's one of the things also that we have, similar to Australia. The minister has the authority to adjust the point system very easily or to introduce new program as required.
So Dan, I don't know about you, but the idea that Congress would vote annually on our level of immigration to this country, as hard as it is for them to take one vote on one tiny part of our immigration system right now. I mean, what strikes me very much is just the level of intentionality in these programs. That the government's not only propose every year, they look at what might be needed, Parliament gets to say, they poll the public, and it's intentionally managed. Our system has been pretty much set it and forget it as far as Congress goes, right? They pass a law and okay, go for it, and it just stays in place forever until something changes or is there a need to change. What's your sense about whether or not, again, sort of a little political guesswork, could we manage such a system in such a way?
Wow. This might be the upside of a parliamentary system, that they're maybe a little better able to deal with these questions. Yeah. Our system has some significant advantages in terms of checks and balances, but it does make it difficult to handle this. And that's why I wouldn't want to see a commission or something, because yes, it might free Congress from its gridlock, but I don't think it has the information, the flexibility to respond to the market. So I don't have a quick answer to that. Political scientists do, but I think we need comprehensive immigration reform in this country. I don't think we should do it under a 2-week deadline leading up to a continuing...
Probably not the best time if you're going to be thoughtful about your process like the Canadians and Australians.
I will just respond to a couple of things. I think in terms of public opinion in this country, we've always been ambivalent about immigration, haven't we? We're very proud of our immigrant heritage. We're always a little uneasy with the current wave coming in, whether it was the Irish 150 years ago or the Italians, and now predominantly Latin American, but I think Americans do tend to support comprehensive immigration reform in the sense of legalizing the dreamers who are here. They want to see a solution to that. They want to see adequate checks to make sure terrorists and criminals don't get in. They want immigrants to work and not go on welfare. I think those are all reasonable expectations. And then in terms of measuring the success of immigrants, no, we don't have a particular government agency charged with doing that. We have had a couple of very thorough National Academy of Sciences studies over the last few years. One, I think, in 2015 on sort of the cultural aspects, 2016 on the economic consequences of immigration. And the conclusion, and these are distinguished panels of experts across the spectrum, was that the immigration assimilation experience in the United States has been largely, if not overwhelmingly, successful. Immigrants learn English. Their children are almost invariably fluent in English, bilingual. By the third generation, forget it, they're just speaking English alone. You know, the United States is a big assimilation machine. We're still known as the graveyard of languages, and that is working. In terms of economically, immigrants are contributing significantly to our economy, in particular the high-skilled immigrants. We need more of them, not fewer. So again, I think our experiences are similar, even though our systems and our history are somewhat different.
So, Michael and Andre, both of you mentioned some changes over time that have been implemented in your system. Is part of those changes as a result of some of this surveying and data? And what do you think may be some of the next changes that are being considered? I think Dan mentioned that Canada's looking at increasing the targets. What are some of the changes forthcoming for your systems?
Sure. I mean, yes, the changes generally respond to what we see in the program. And I guess if you look at recent changes, there's been a slight increase in our English language thresholds for skilled migration, and they apply across both the points tested categories and the employer sponsored categories. And there's a wealth of data and research on the importance of English in terms of a determinant of migrant success in Australia. So we're often adjusting. Another significant change is the introduction of a system called Skill Select, which is our system which captures expressions of interest from potential migrants. We then issue invitations to those migrants to apply under the points tested categories. What that lets us do is vary according to occupations, the number of invitations we issue, the respective scores that we set for different occupations, and that's about being able to target a program and control a program according to whatever labour market needs there are. More recently, the government's introduced some changes that will be taking effect fairly shortly around our temporary employer-sponsored categories. And these go around more targeting. I guess they were far broader in the past. They'll be more targeted, and the criteria will be raised slightly as well. But that's just a couple of things.
Andre, what's kind of looking at?
So, yes, the continuous increase in immigration, and so trying to aim at 1% by in 3 years' time, and in all categories. So all categories are increasing in number at the same time. One of the things that, based on the measure of success, the earning incomes in that study that is ongoing, one of the things we changed is in 2016 in our point system, we decreased the number of points given to arrange employment because we found that it was then giving us mostly lower skilled occupations, and we're not getting the high end. And so we were getting people from the food industries and cooks and all that, which, you know, we said can go through the provincial nominee system. We want to have the human capital, and so we adjusted the point. And all the research that had been done on the longer longitudinal studies shows that really the arranged employment has really a good benefit in 1 or 2 years in the longer term. What drove the economic growth and the innovation and the best success of immigrants was the one with the higher human capital. So we changed those points. We also adjusted, so the system gets to be adjusted to meet other needs of the populations as well. So one of the needs, and it's a government priority, is Francophone community outside of Quebec. And so we gave more points now for knowledge of French in our system so that, these get selected and we'll have more Francophone immigrations.
So just to be clear, so you said Francophone outside of Quebec. So Quebec selects its own immigrants.
Yes, it's people in...
apparently French is very big in that selection, so I'm sure.
Yes.
But if somebody wants to settle in Saskatchewan or Yukon Territory and speaks French, they can get...
They can get extra points. We also adjusted to give points to siblings, for having siblings in Canada. And that's recognizing, and it's not a lot of points, but that may make the difference if you're invited to apply or not. Recognizing that siblings may be assisting you in the integrations and all that. And again, responding to the populations and what the polls has indicated. They says we want to have that possibilities of having our brothers and sisters. We don't want to go to a family reunification system, but we recognize that in the point system. So we adjust constantly.
So just to be clear, on the family reunification side, you can't necessarily sponsor your sibling, but if you're coming in the point system and you have siblings already in Canada, that can give you extra points. So there's a family component even in the skills selection process. Okay.
And in general, you raise a good point, is that when we talk about point system, if you look at our overall immigration, there's only about 20% that are selected on points. Because when you calculate and the family reunification, the humanitarian class, but also the dependents of the people who are selected on points, these ones are not selected on points. So it's really 20% that we select on point. And it didn't change the fact that overall, all immigration categories have been contributing positively to the economy and to the society. Some of them take longer, but...
So Dan, I think something you just pointed out is if we're looking at the successful integration of immigrants into society, family relationships matter there. And so the idea that we should just discount family reunification as a necessity seems to be something that, at least in Canada, they see the opposite. The other thing I would just point out is, I think Andre said 20% are actually selected through the skill system, and then the remainder of those who immigrate are dependent family members. You mentioned in our system it's about 13, 14%, or was it that are 14% are through the employment base, but really only half of them are the actual workers because the rest of them are the family members. Is that about correct too, right?
That's correct. Although they may be high skilled as well, people tend to pair by education. So, but yeah, that 14% is really kind of an upper bound. But yeah, that's a great point. That the great American immigrant assimilation machine has relied on families, people coming here because they had family members or people from their village, and that helps them. We actually require before somebody gets a green card, their relatives have to sign an affidavit that they'll support them for 5 years so that they don't go on welfare. Well, if you don't have any relatives here, who's going to sign the affidavit? So the two have traditionally been linked, and that's why I think we shouldn't rely primarily just on cutting back family migration, but look at increasing overall immigration. If I could just put up one more chart, the 1%, Andre mentioned the 1%. I just want to show you how this is net U.S. migration, again, per 1,000 population. And you see, Canada and Australia are really where we were over a century ago when we had the Great Atlantic Migration. There we were approaching 1% of the population coming in as immigrants per year. In my paper, I propose increasing legal immigration by 30%, just the opposite of the RAISE Act, the Cotton-Purdue Act. But all that would do is get us back to we're at about 3.3 immigrants per 1,000 population. That would get us up to 4.3, which is the historical average. If you average all those bars, if just our historical average would require a 30% increase in legal immigration, which I think we'd be well able to absorb in this country, profitably the benefit, but we'd still be less than half of what Canada's target migration rate is going to be very shortly.
So I have to point out that net negative bar there, that is at 1930 to 1940.
Great Depression.
So it's a Great Depression, but it also follows the Immigration Act of 1924, which was the most restrictive immigration act we have ever passed in the United States, that restricted immigration probably about 30, 40% from where it had been. So, and then, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of other factors there, but the recession came shortly out there. We'll just leave it to your own devices to figure out if there's a relationship there. But let's acknowledge that. So we're going to turn it over to the audience for some questions now. I imagine that there's a lot of different questions that people might have for our panelists. So I'll ask, first of all, please ask questions rather than make statements. Not that we don't appreciate your opinion, but we're trying to gather information for the group. If you can identify who you are and where you're from, and then if you're directing your question to a particular panelist or any of the panelists. So do we have questions? We have a gentleman over here. Do we have some mic runners, if you wouldn't mind, because we have people watching on the internet and other places, to wait for the mic. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center. And gentlemen, thank you. Curtis Etherly with the Coca-Cola Company. Quick question for any of the three of you, and that is, one, the experience, perhaps for our country friends, the experience with low-wage or low-skill jobs. If you could talk a little bit about whether you run into challenges. That is, of course, one of the chief concerns or criticisms here. And then I'd be curious about the wages as they relate to your immigrant categories. Do you see any kind of connection to lower wages versus native-born employees? I'm just very curious about impact on wages as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael or Andre, who wants to go first?
Perhaps I'll go first and touch on the second part of your question, and thank you for that. In terms of impact on wages, what we tend to see is migrants initially coming in with wages, this is skilled migrants as well, with wages slightly lower than the native-born population. That factors in the fact, settling in period. So after that 6-month period of our survey, the wages are a little lower. By the time we get to the 18-month period, that's equalled out. So you get an average salary that's very similar to the native-born average. What we do see as well is far greater participation rates from migrants, which is a key element. Our skilled program's about participation, productivity and population, and by that we mean age and dealing with demographic challenges, so far younger cohort. We don't have a low-skilled migration program. It is definitely targeted towards skilled migrants. We do have some small temporary programs that are related to our aid program in the Pacific, that are seasonal worker programs that do allow unskilled labourers to enter Australia and work in particular fields, but we're talking very small numbers there. We also have temporary visa programs that have work rights, but the main purpose of the visa is another purpose. So we have, in Australia, international students have work rights of 20 hours a week. And we have work and holiday visas, which allows young people to come for a year with unlimited work rights. But that question, I guess, because we're targeted at the skilled end, really doesn't come to be an issue. That's intentional targeting, is that migrants are about filling skills gaps, not about displacing Australians at the lower end of the salary range.
Andre?
And I think the answer would be quite similar. I will just make a distinction between wages and income, right? So wages for similar occupation, whether it's a migrant, a recent immigrant or a Canadian, will be the same, right? It's with the occupations. So in terms of income, it's the same at the beginning. Then what the studies are showing is that immigrants in the first year or so, the skilled immigrants, will earn less than a Canadian average, but that's simply because the time to have maybe their credential fully recognized, finding a job, exactly at the level being recognized, and after that they'll have, the same. And then, in the highly skilled will even fare better than Canadians in the longer term than the Canadian average. But for same occupation, they receive the same wage, right? It's getting to the occupation at their level takes the time, of maybe a year to adjust and finding that. For the unskilled worker, again, most of them will be done through the provincial nominee program, and no, we haven't seen, they are selected because there is no Canadian to do that job. So they're filling a gaps, and the wage will be the one that are staged for anybody who's taking that job, Canadian or immigrants, and we haven't seen any impact on lowering lowering wages in those occupations in Canada. And like Australia, also we have temporary foreign worker program that will fill some acute needs, including some of the lower skilled. And every effort is made to increase participation of Canadians into the economy as well, right? And so it's not just immigration, then you'll have other programs to retrain people and get them active in the workforce. And so really you're filling a gap when you come to immigration. You're not displacing anybody and you don't see an impact on wage and income.
Thank you. Other questions? This gentleman over here.
Thank you. Buenos días. My name is Walter Tejada. I'm with Tejada Consulting Services in Virginia. This question is primarily to the gentleman from Australia and Canada, but you're welcome to also comment. It seems that there's a lack of will in this country to really do comprehensive immigration reform, which is, I think, as it was mentioned, the overwhelming majority of the American public would like. So my question for you is what suggestions you would have, particularly like that some of us have the impression that Canada and Australia are overwhelmingly white population majority countries. So some of the arguments in this country, the economic argument, tax contributions, for example, doesn't cut it, even though the overwhelming majority of immigrants undocumented contribute to the system subsidizing all the retiring Americans through the Social Security fund and so on. The crime index doesn't cut it because evidence shows that immigrants commit less crimes than the native population. And we can go on about those indexes. So do you have a white index fear factor management tool in your countries that could be possibly considered in this country? The truth is, folks, what's deep in their heart is sometimes let out inadvertently or on a statement they might make. Recently, the president mentioned that countries from El Salvador, Haiti, and African countries were not necessarily welcome. He used other language. But countries from, people from countries like Norway are. My understanding is Norway is probably majority white country. So do you have any suggestions on how the white fear factor is being handled in your countries, and what lessons could the United States take from that? We have a browning of America going on here. The white population fell a little behind a number of decades ago. So, we are where we are now. What suggestions do you have, other than so that the indexes that clearly have data to back it up? Let's just be blunt and talk about that as another factor that maybe ought to be direct about, and so that we can make a rational adjustment to our immigration policy.
Let me redirect the question slightly.
Thanks,
I mean, how would you respond to the criticism that selection processes that are aimed at more highly skilled immigrants are going to favor more developed countries, for example, which for a lot of the world may be more Anglo? I mean, do you face those criticisms, one, at home, and two, and maybe more broadly, how do you look at your migration program in terms of your overall demographics? So in Canada, you do have a particular francophone issue, but francophonie is worldwide, right? They can come from a lot of different places. In Australia, I'm not sure how that managed, but talk about a little of the demographic impacts of your systems.
I can start. So in terms of the highly skilled immigrations, then maybe favoring more developed countries, well, as was said at the beginning, the fourth top source country of immigrations for Canada has been, quite stable over the last decade, and it's India, China, Philippines, and Pakistan. And the same also in terms of the skill migration. So developing countries have talents. They have universities, they have, look at what's happening in terms of industries in China and India and across the world. I mean, yes, that's where our skilled immigration, because we don't see that much interest of people leaving Western Europe to come to Canada, right? They are into a society where they're faring well. So that's not where our immigration is coming from. And 20% of foreign born, and the first top countries, 4 top countries are the one I just mentioned, then you can imagine that, you know, our countries demographically is changing this way, and the face of Canada is changing this way. For Francophonie, it's the same thing. When Quebec selects, most of the immigrants will come. There'll be a portion that comes from France, but a lot comes from the Maghreb and Francophone Africa. And it's also changing the face of Quebec. But then the important is to do the integration, ensuring that, you know, they integrate in the labor market, they're not displacing anybody. They also are part, they go into the schools. So, I mean, everybody gets to know an immigrant, right? And there's a lot of programs that is made also to advertise the success of immigrants. So Canadians can see, you know, that, yeah, they're doing well. And that's why when we polled recently again, there's an overwhelmingly support for immigration in all 3 categories, and continuing that balance, and also the need to do the humanitarian aspect. And that's...
And if you haven't been to a city like Toronto recently, where half the city is born in another country, and the variety of nationalities is amazing, you haven't understood Canada. Canada's white only because it has snow. That's what I would say right now. Michael, what about Australia and its demography?
Yeah, I think looking at the demographics, you've got 28% of the population overseas born. If you look at first generation, you've got more than half the population is either overseas born themselves or their parent was born overseas. And you look at that makeup of our migration program over, you know, the last, getting on to 2 decades, and really India and China are the dominant countries. The UK also features significantly. But then as you move down the list, there's a number of countries. The Philippines is also there, and I think probably a number of similar countries. I certainly don't want to go near that question, sorry, in terms of suggestions for the US. But I'd point out that in our very distant past, in fact, so distant that it was before I was born, there was a collection of policies in Australia that has come to be known as the White Australia policy. So there was, going back to our federation in 1900, there was a program that was, you know, racially based. What we now have is a migration program that is, the policy position is it's non-discriminatory, and in that we mean non-discriminatory in the sense of race, religion, ethnic background. Of course, we discriminate on the basis of skills, and I think this is part of the response to that question is that it's all about what the migrants can bring to Australia, and I think that helps influence Australian attitudes toward migrants. Now, I wouldn't suggest this is a topical and contested area in Australia, migration, it always is, but the extent to which you know, we've been able to demonstrate the benefits to Australia of migration, economic benefits, social, cultural benefits, probably goes some way to addressing that issue. But I wouldn't assume any answers for the US there.
Dan, do you want to speak for the United States?
Well, this is yet another way I think we can learn from our friends in Canada and Australia. I don't think we should have a whiff of ethnic engineering in the US immigration system. That's what we had explicitly in the immigration acts of the 1920s. They were explicitly meant not just to keep us predominantly white country, but white Northern European. And I think that was rightly, that system was rightly put aside in the 1960s. We still engage in a little bit of that. We have per country quotas. You can't have more than 7% of immigrants from any country. I think that's absurd when you consider India and China representing about half of mankind between the two of them, and yet we have a cap of between the two, 14%. I think we should do away.
China has the same cap as Singapore.
Yes.
Let's just think about that proportionality, right?
It's absurd, and that is a kind of ethnic engineering, saying we don't want people from these populous countries. I think we should do away with that. I have to say, this might be a little controversial, but the diversity lottery program is a bit of ethnic engineering in its own way. I'd be happy to see that program go away, and, a big and, take those 50,000 visas and award them through employment-based migration to high-skilled immigrants from all these countries, getting away with the doing away with the per country quotas. I think immigrants should be judged as individuals, not on ethnicity, not where they're from. That's why I think the president's comments were outrageous and not appropriate for our national interests. And judge them on individual basis. If that tends to have immigrants from particular countries, so be it.
Okay. A couple more questions. Wait, can you wait for the mic, please? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jordan from American Immigration's Lawyers Association. My question is directed at both of you again. We haven't really talked about the shortcomings maybe of your immigration policies in both of those countries. Could you maybe touch on issues that you are dealing with, maybe around illegal immigration, maybe around is there a lack of family immigration because you do have that percentage so low, or are you, as kind of Dan mentioned, able to invite all of the family base that you need?
Sure. Do you want to address sort of the controversies du jour in Canada and Australia?
One of the main issues that we're working on is with foreign credential recognitions, right? Is to make sure that, we select, bright people with the skill in this, and when they come into Canada, to make sure that then the employers and the sectors recognize those credentials. So there's a lot of work that is ongoing with that, and that's been a challenge, especially since in Canada it's against provincial and territorial responsibility, so you have to work, with each one of them. But that's something that is going better and better. So, but that would be our most challenge. What we've seen over the years also that had been a challenge was when we did not control the intake, how many people could apply in a particular category, which meant that it grew with large backlogs, right? Which is not fair for the persons who's applying, who's waiting, what's the outcome of my immigration to Canada, and had to wait for 7 years. And it's not good for us as well because, they were looking at immigrating at that point of time, meeting a need of that point of time. So what we changed and we learned from that is we have introduced intake control in most our categories. In terms of family immigrations, that's why the level is going up. So we can be able to also take all the family reunification as our program is defined. And another challenge is anything that doesn't follow our managed system is one that can create, a challenge for us because we have the support of Canadians because the system is balanced, the system is managed, and it's working well. So irregular migrations can cause a challenge, and the government has to make sure they're able to respond to those challenges so we can maintain the support.
Michael?
Look, just that point about balance is a constant balancing act, immigration policy, and there's a lot of adjustments to it as we attempt to balance the various issues. It's about impacts on the Australian labour market, on the Australian economy, trying to manage those impacts. I guess the extent to which a native population will support immigration will be influenced by the nature of those impacts. Immigration is a very topical subject in Australia. I think there's been significant interest in Australia's approach to illegal maritime arrivals. We're an island, we have a particular regime in terms of the way we handle people arriving by boat or attempting to arrive by boat. So there's a fair degree of controversy there. The underlying view, though, is that a managed system, and a system that demonstrates to the Australian public that it's managed and that the government is managing the flow of migrants, allows for general popular support for a level of migration. I touched on the temporary to permanent issue earlier. One of the problems we've had in the past is I guess a growing expectation among a growing number of temporary residents that they would achieve permanent status. Now, of course, that's not going to happen unless you're expanding your permanent migration program endlessly. So that's a constant source of tension. I guess you can see there's always tightening of requirements in terms of that transition from temporary to permanence, but that's again about government having control over that flow of people and being able to demonstrate that the program is being managed.
Okay. We're about ready to wrap up, and there are a whole lot more questions we can ask, but Dan, I'm going to ask you to finish up here. So if you had to just sort of encapsulate what you think the lessons that America could learn from the Canadian and Australian systems, if we're going to look at what our system could be in the future, what do you think are maybe the top 3 things that we should pay attention to from these systems?
Well, there are some profound lessons here, and it isn't just theory. These are 2 very important countries in the world, important U.S. allies that have had immigration policies somewhat different than ours, and they've been successful by every measure. Can they be tweaked? Can they be improved? Yes. I think one lesson is a modern economy, advanced economy, can accept a significant share of immigration as a share of the population over and above what we do in the United States. In raw numbers, we set the pace, but as a share of our population, we're pretty far down on the list, actually, among developed countries. Secondly, we can go back and forth about the ideal system, but I think what you've heard is all 3 systems are a kind of hybrid. Ours tilts more towards demand-driven, theirs is more towards the government. Both have some advantages. I'd be happy to take on their merit-based system in exchange for their numbers. And I guess those 2 big things, the overall level of migration, I think they tilt as a share towards employment-based migration, but you notice it hasn't come at the expense of family immigration, and they've made some wonderful arguments about how the 2 complement each other. And it doesn't have to be from countries like Norway. I think all 3 countries show that the ethnicity, the country of origin of the immigrants doesn't really matter. What matters is the character of the individual immigrants. Immigrants are a self-selected group. They tend to have an extra dose of not only higher education often, but gumption and get up and go, and initiative and ambition. And I think we should welcome more immigrants. It should be about more legal immigration, not less, here in the United States. And we have 2 powerful arguments in Canada and Australia in favor of that.
So I would just add to that, I think what we heard at the end is that the receptivity of a public to immigration is directly proportional to how well they think the systems are managed. And Canada and Australia have made a lot of efforts to understand how the public feels about their systems, to express to the public how the system is managed. And I think that's maybe something we have not done very well in the United States in terms of talking to our public about our immigration system. And if you look at polls, an awful lot of people may have a underlying idea that immigration could be good for America, and yet don't see our system necessarily being good for America. So we probably need to do a better job at that. Well, I want to thank our guests very much. Please join me in thanking them. As I said, there's probably a lot more that we could talk about here. We only have a limited period of time. If you have more questions about the Canadian or Australian migration systems, I suggest very strongly go visit their embassy websites. They have a lot of good information about their systems, and you can find out more about what we have written about our system on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. Thank you all for joining us.